Shalom, shalom, everybody. Ariel Bar Tzadok here from the KosherTorah School, found online at www.KosherTorah.com. Tonight, I am bringing you lesson number 6 in my series, which I've called Kabbalah 101 Plus. Beyond the basics, of course, teaching you the Kabbalah that your other rabbis won't talk about. Yeah. And tonight is actually going to be a very, very important, more of a historical lesson as much as it's going to be about psychic and psychological issues. For those of you who are my supporting students, and you know we have our private Sunday evening class, time stamping ourselves last night, because this is a Monday night class here, we did this same exact lesson as it was related to the Shadi Kedusha text. So for those of you who were there on our previous night, tonight is going to be kind of overlap. Might be adding a little bit more interesting stuff like I always do, so stay tuned. Tonight the topic is going to be the big bait and switch, the big transition. For those of you who know me well here at the KosherTorah School, you know I place strong emphasis between what we call Torah Secrets in Hebrew Sitrei Torah and Kabbalah, which is usually referred to as Jewish mysticism. Aren't they one and the same? Well, it all depends how semantical or literal we want to be, but technically speaking, not only are they not the same, they're practically mutually exclusive from one another. And that is what we're going to talk about tonight. In our two lessons ago, in lesson 4, we discussed the issues of the Ma'aseh Merkava, one of the 3 schools that our rabbis say there's, only for, private distribution kind of stuff. And we then last week digressed into a whole topic of discussion about angels and higher dimensional interactions and the like. And now this is going to be the natural progression, because I'm sure, as you know, most rabbis today wouldn't know a higher dimensional, interdimensional interaction if it literally hit them between the eyes with a 2x4. And I'm even speaking about many of the Kabbalists, so-called Kabbalists today. And we need to understand, like I said, what on earth happened. And this is it. We know that prophecy, and when we use the word prophecy, I do not want to sound religious, such as, "Thus saith the Lord." Okay, that's great for understanding prophecy if you want to portray it in a movie or something like that, but that's not how it was. We know very well from the accounts recorded in Tanakh that if one wanted to learn to become a prophet, men and women both, you had to go to school. You actually went to the prophet's school. And it's referenced very clearly in Tanakh, and that there were techniques and methods used of how to acquire the spirit of prophecy. It included music and dance, very similar to one of the modern forms that have actually continued in these traditions or amongst our brothers in Islam. And I speak of the whirling dervishes of the Sufi orders. And there were even Jewish members of the Sufi order. And Rabbi Chaim Vital, redactor of the RE system, had many interactions with many of the Sufi sheikhs as well. So there is a long history of stuff. But now let's see and learn what happened to it. There is a common statement that with the conclusion of the prophecies of the last 3 prophets of the Tanakh, which of course are Haggai and Zechariah and Malachi, that prophecy ceased from Israel. Okay, that is technically true, but unless we actually know and understand what prophecy really is, we're not going to understand what the statement says. So, by the way, the statement does continue and say Ruach HaKodesh continued. And if you don't know what Ruach HaKodesh is, divine inspiration, again, it's a meaningless statement. So what exactly is prophecy? Reb Chaim, in his Shadei Kedusha, goes and elaborates in this in his own ways and means and language. But let's just sum it up and say like this. Prophecy is when God chooses to appoint a representative to speak on his behalf to the collective, to the world, to Israel, etc. No longer do we have such representatives. Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi were the last ones. With that being said, our sages spoke truth. Prophecy has come to an end. But remember, you went to school to learn how to kind of like go up there. Well, those lessons never ceased. People continue to learn them and, needless to say, practice them. Everybody went up. But once they got up there, like Daniel, like Zechariah, instead of meeting with God, they're meeting with all the different malachim. And they're having interactions with the higher dimension. But it looks like kind of like there's a door, kind of like in that higher dimension there that's at the present time closed. And we call that, of course, the psychic or psychological state of exile, galut. Okay, with that being said, the nature of psychic ascent continues. The nature of psychic interaction continues. Maybe God is no longer sending any representative to the nation, but it doesn't mean if God wants to have a private conversation with somebody that he, she, it doesn't. God do whatever God wants to do. And the malachim who are up there interact with people all the time to this very day. But as the decades rolled by, and remember this, there is a unfortunate lack of continuity, if you will, between the traditional Orthodox dating of the destruction of the temple to its actual date. The actual date of the destruction of the first temple was 586 BC, rebuilt right around 516 BC. And according to certain modern Orthodox renditions, they try to put the building of the temple at 423 BCE. And then the 2 or 3 or 4 generations of Zerubbabel and Yehoshua and Ezra and Nehemiah, all within the crunched time of the coming of Alexander the Great. Well, if the temple was destroyed in about 420 BCE, it was only rebuilt about 350 BCE, then 20 years later, Alexander's there, and you had like 4 generations in 20 years. The numerations that you'll find in books like Art Scroll and the like are incorrect. Just to let you know that. 586 BC. And 516 BC, we started to rebuild. And it took a long, long time. Over this period, the Persian Empire, of course, overtook the Babylonian Empire and grew and prospered. And a point that many of you may not know. King Achashverosh, you know him, of course, from the story of Queen Esther. Well, Achashverosh is a Hebrew, rendition of the old Persian name. And the Persian emperor, who we know as Achashverosh in the Bible, was known in Persia as Xerxes. And Xerxes, you might be familiar with from one of his most famous military campaigns in which he failed. And that, of course, was Thermopylae, in which he came against King Leonidas and the Spartans. Many of you might be familiar with the very violently graphic version of the Thermopylae battle that came out in a movie, I think it was with Gerald Butler, called The 300, intense film. But they portrayed Xerxes as this big, giant, bald guy covered with gold chains, etc. That's Esther's husband. Yeah. Okay, moving right along. Oh, by the way, most likely in Xerxes' armies were contingents of Jewish or Israelite soldiers. I don't think the Israelites are fighting on behalf of the Greeks. Certainly not then. But continuing with our story. At around 330, the Persian Empire, of course, fell to the onslaught, the forces of the Greeks under Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great, of course, spread his empire from Western Europe all the way to Eastern Asia. And he Hellenized his entire empire. And it was under the influence of Alexander's Rebbe. You all know who Alexander the Great's Rebbe, his teacher. You know who that was, don't you? Aristotle. Yeah, the good old Aristotle guy. He was with Alexander. They traveled together. They knew, they learned, and etc. and so on. So the Aristotelian way of looking at the world then spread throughout the world. And Aristotle was a rebel. Of course, he rebelled against his teacher, Plato. Plato spoke of the higher worlds and the abstracts and what I guess we could call archetypes. Aristotle was the materialist. He says, what I see is the only thing that's there, that's it. What I see is what's there. Everything is natural. Everything forms the natural order. And we got to go according to the rational, natural way. So, while Plato, if you will, had his, in quote, head in the clouds, Aristotle had his feet on the ground. And the two of them were radically different from one another. And these two Greek philosophers pretty much are responsible for the formation, the structures of all of Western civilization. Yeah, it came out of these two guys. Gosh, they had that much power. With that being said, what was their influence in Israel and, of course, on Judaism? Well, we all know the Hellenist influence. We all know the story of the Maccabees. Israel was enamored with Hellenistic culture, which didn't stop there. It also embraced the Hellenistic Greek philosophies, concepts, etc. And a lot of this was even adopted and embraced by our sages. Now, prior to this, a point that's made very clear in the book of Maccabees, when, what's his name, Anatochus, you should call him, he's slurred names there, up in Syria, I remember he was a Greek Syrian. He wanted to unite everybody under a one world kumbaya government. Everybody's beautiful. Everybody's the same. We're all united. Sound familiar? And we're all the same. And therefore, Zeus of the Greeks and Yahweh of the Jews, it's all one and the same. So we put up a statue of Zeus in the Jerusalem temple, all kumbaya. Well, of course, as you know, they tried to impose that mandate on the public. They said, no, it's not enough. You got to do what we tell you to do. Shades of modern times. And, needless to say, it led to violent rebellion. We all know the Maccabee story. But pay attention to the book of Maccabees. It says that there are a group of these Hasidim, righteous and pious ones, who are already out in the hills. These were the righteous who already looked to Jerusalem as a compromised place. All urban life in ancient Israel, Second Temple Israel, was compromised. And as such, they just withdrew. They went out into the hills. Maybe they were the Essenes and similar type of groups, or not. Let the scholars debate that one. But these, like the Essenes, carried on the ancient traditions of psychic ascent. They were the ones who went into the meditative trances. And indeed, if you look at that specific school, and you got to understand again, the Essenes are not a pre-Christian Jewish sect. They had nothing to do with Christianity. The Essenes were the most extreme, right-wing, misogynist, anti-Gentile. They were like a Taliban of their day. I don't mention Essenes in a good light. But there wasn't such a demarcation separating them from our sages, the rabbis. This distinction, when you say Pharisee, the Hebrew word is perush, or perushi, which means the separate ones. And the way that Rabbi Chaim Vital, in his introduction to the Shari Kedusha, he describes the Pharisees, our sages. But the way he describes them is exactly a description of the Essenes. So the distinction between these two groups, I think there's a real blurry line there. The difference most likely was in halachic issues, most likely about the laws of tahara, purity, the temple, and the like. But I don't think anybody looked at each other as a heretic. I'm pretty sure that what we would call the Essenes today are very much represented in the Gemara, of course, but not by those names. I think they would be represented like they are in the Gemara as what was it called? The Hasidim Rishonim, or the Eda Kadisha of Yerushalayim. They had all these different names. It's recorded in Tractate Berachot of the Gemara, 4th, 5th chapters. So these guys were always there. What made them different? This is something very interesting when you look at the difference between our traditional rabbinic way of understanding Torah and their way, which they had exclusive to themselves. As you know, when we try to come to understanding the Chumash, the Torah, halacha or otherwise, we try to understand what's the basic bottom line. What is it saying to us, realistically? Let's not elaborate with moralistic details. Let's not elaborate with legendary stories. And certainly let's not exaggerate in all kinds of other ways. What is what we call in Hebrew the pshat? Simple, straightforward meaning. And even when you read later commentaries like Rashi, who is actually very midrashic, moralistic, teaching all kinds of stories, we still call that pshat. And we have numerous different interpretations of what exactly is the pshat of a thing. Someone says this, someone says that. Well, in these other communities, they did not have something called pshat. They had something called pesher. They believed that the leader of their community, which they called the More Tzedek, the teacher of righteousness. And yes, you'll even find a reference to a More Tzedek in the Gemara. Some believe that that's supposed to be like a mention of Eliyahu Navi. That only their More Tzedek had the Ruach HaKodesh to know the real pshat of the meanings of Torah at the time. And their leaders would then turn to words of the prophets, so the Torah, and in their believed Ruach HaKodesh, divine inspiration, would provide an interpretation of current events in light of the words of the prophets. And they said that's exactly what it means for our time here and now. And their word was accepted as, halakha. That's the pesher way. We don't do that anymore. Probably for the best. But anyway, all during the time of the growing Hellenistic influence, there grew a completely and very different way of understanding life in general, based upon the Aristotelian model. In original, what we call Hebraic thinking, it was very, what we use the term today, right-brained. It was very intuitive. It was very psychic. It was very heartfelt. And proof of this is just read the words of Tanakh. Read the books like Proverbs and Kohelet and even Shir HaShirim, Song of Songs. All of these things represented the ancient Hebraic mindset. It was at the same time very mundane, down to earth, and at the same time sublime and high. Well, along came that Greek mentality and said, forget all this sublime and high stuff. Aristotle really fought against that mentality, which he rejected in his own teacher, Plato, and in all the other meditative systems throughout the old world, Babylon, Persia, Israel, Egypt, and the like. He referred to, as the Greeks did, that that's all mythology. All right? They wanted to call it superstition. And they wanted to set men free in order to be rationalists, which is the predominant mentality in our society today. Well, with the growth of this rationalist attitude towards life, the psychic intuitive became socially unacceptable. And the psychic and intuitive types were marginalized and pushed to the edges of society, and they grew less and less in number. Now, our sages, the Perushim, interestingly, were able to embrace both sides. And if you've ever studied rabbinic literature, you see in the Gemara, you're reading tedious, meticulous, analytical details of a verse of scripture or words of Mishnah to get to the real essence and details of the practice of halakha. But one thing's very curious you might notice about the Gemara. The Gemara, the Talmud, it's not a code of law. Nowhere can you point into the Talmud and say, the law is. Indeed, the Gemara itself says, Tractate Nida, that Eino posek halacha mepi Gemara. We don't learn halacha from Gemara. Gemaras provide for us principles and details, analytical understanding. And you know something pesky about the Gemara that drives the modern people nuts? They don't like it, so they actually edit and delete it out of their studies. Every page of the Gemara, where you're getting into the tedious, rational, intellectual details, all of a sudden they fling off into the wild realms of imaginative speculation and stories and the like, which really conceal really deep lessons. This is called Agadata. And every page of the Gemara goes from rational intellect, intuitive psychic, rational intellect, intuitive psychic, back and forth and back. You see, our sages recognize the nature of the transition in process. And over a period of 1,000 years, they fine-tuned the balance. So for those who come to study Gemara, you will find that that's probably the most deepest of all, in quote, psychic spiritual texts ever in our Jewish tradition. It is certainly much more Kabbalistic than anything in the Zohar. Because the pervading mentality amongst our sages was very much to embrace the Greek philosophical model all along. The entire concept of the rational, the analytical, and the dialectic, this all comes from the Greek philosophy. There's nothing Hebraic about that at all. You don't see any of that in ancient Hebraic literature. But our sages knew and understood what was going on, and they claimed, according to Pshat, that this was actually a fulfillment of ancient prophecy. Because in the book of Genesis, after the flood, when Noah is blessing his 3 sons, he makes a statement that Yafet would dwell in the tents of Shem. Yafet, of course, was the father of Yavan. Yavan is Greece. And so the sages said it was a prophecy from ancient times that the Greek wisdom would be absorbed and embraced into Judaism and elevated to holiness. And it has. The whole concept of Pshat, as we understand it today, as we practice it today, is that Grecian dialectic mentality. So very, very foreign from the original Hebraic psychic intuitive. Our original sages were great and profound masters of both. So take a look at someone like the character of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the legendary author of the Zohar. Now, he never really wrote it, probably never ever saw it, had any idea or any connection to it. But that's beside the point. Well, there was the episode recorded in the Gemara that, for political reasons, remember, Shimon Bar Yochai was a student of, a Talmid of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva was clearly of the ascender school. He's one of the guys who's going hanging up in the higher dimensions, having lunch with Metatron. So Rabbi Akiva, he was the guy who went up in and out of the Pardes in peace. He knew his stuff, and he taught it to his Talmid, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who, like him, became a right-wing extremist. So when talk goes about the government, Shimon Bar Yochai, of course, says something derogatory, and it leads them coming after him, pursuing him for his life, and he goes, like Eliyahu Navi, old school, and hides out in a cave. Stays there, according to 12 years, 13 years. He comes out, and it says that he saw this guy, Yehuda ben Gerim, who betrayed him to the Roman authorities. And he says, this guy's still alive. And he gave him one of these Darth Vader looks. And the guy and fell down dead. Philosophical rabbis don't do that. You got to know how to do that. So that's an Elisha kind of stuff. That's an Eliyahu Hanavi kind of stuff. So he had the power. He had the knowledge. He had the experience. All throughout the Gemara, we read of strange stories of our rabbis. Like Rashba. Rashba is said to have used the Sefer Yetzirah, used the powers of the higher dimensions, manipulated them, and created artificial animals, artificial humans, and the like. Very interesting stuff. And golems, are they real? No, I got a whole big book on the laws of golems, which also includes the laws of mermaids. Very interesting stuff. So yeah, we take this stuff very literally. And those who actually practice and interact with the psychic energies and recognize them and interact with them, recognize the reality of these things. Because the nature and way of creating what we call an artificial life form is not a spiritual technology, if you will, exclusive to Jews and Judaism. The Tibetan Buddhists do this, and they call it a tulpa. You do have others, many traditions, who know about astral projection and shape-shifting their forms and come in all kinds of sizes and shapes and stuff. Eliyahu Navi used to do it, and so does a lot of others. These are the experiencers who know what they're doing. But as Judaism developed, the experiential school maintained itself. And it was there throughout the Talmudic period. Actually, very well represented in the Talmud itself, in many of the Agadah stories. Much of what we call the Hechalot, the Merkavah, the ascent literature, the Enochian literature, all was written during this period. So while prophecy ceased, psychic interactions with the higher dimensions continued, as always, even in the presence of the rational, analytical way of understanding the world. And this is why and how we developed a two-tier religion. Hebraic thinking, Greco thinking. Hebraic thinking became less and less and less to the point where it was isolated to small groups who kind of had to keep it to themselves because most people just couldn't handle it. And that's why it was called the Sitrei Torah, the secrets of the Torah. Everybody else had everything else. And this is the way Judaism was for 1,000 years. And we should end the story right here. But as you know, like Paul Harvey would say, now for the rest of the story. All during this time, you had in this period, the writing of the famous Sefer Yetzirah, And the Sefer Yetzirah, some say it was from the 3rd century, 4th century, whatever, let the scholars debate, who cares, is the first place that we have a reference to this interesting term used in Kabbalah today called Sephiroth. Now, if I were to ask you, what are Sephiroth? Everybody raise their hand. I know. They're the 10 emanations of the divine light of God. Keter, Chochmah, Bina, etc. Very good. All right, little brownie point for you that you learned your lesson. But the Sefer Yetzirah doesn't say anything of the kind. The Sefer Yetzirah has absolutely no mention or reference to any names of Sephiroth, or certainly any association of them with anything as divine attributes. Where on earth does that idea come from? Put a check there, because we're going to get back to that. Now, looking into the Sefer Yetzirah, the beginnings, the author, originator of the term Sephiroth. Well, what are these Sephiroth? I got the greatest idea. Let's go look into the commentaries and see what they say. Sound like an idea? The earliest commentaries to the Sefer Yetzirah date from around the 8th, 9th century till about the 10th, 11th century. We can include within them the writings of Shabtai Donolo, Rabbi Sadia Gaon, and of course, Rabbi Eliezer of Worms, who is very well known to us as the author of the mystical magical book called Raziel HaMalach. Yeah, the book says it was from Adam, passed down. Okay, you know that the story, please, it's not literal. So, chill out with that. But anyway, if you read the book of Raziel, it says right on the opening page, this book is so holy that if it's in your house, it will protect your house from fire and all loss and everything else. And I know people who really believe that. They'll take the book and throw it in the fire thinking that's going to put out the fire, and yeah. Okay, cool and groovy. Moving right along. What do these commentaries, these original early commentaries of the Sefer Yetzirah, say about Sephiroth? Dramatic pause here. Well, what do you think is missing? All the ideas and all the concepts of them being divine emanations of God ain't there. They are not looked at, interpreted to be, understood as anything of the kind. Something completely different. As to what those things are, I did a whole course on the first chapter of Sefer Yetzirah from the original commentaries. It's available on KosherTorah if you want to go take the course. It's about 12, 13, 14 hours. I don't remember exactly now. Did that 4 years ago. And I can sum up 13, 14 hours in 3 or 4 minutes. Go take the course. Check it out. Read the syllabus. It's online. But it's not what you think. So, where did the ideas that we hold today, that the Sephiroth are these divine emanations, 10 in number, and we know their names, Keter, Chochmah, Bina, etc. Where did all that come from? Well, something happened. Somewhere, maybe the late 1100s, 1200s, right around the time of Maimonides. In southern France, northern Spain, right around the place where the Albigenese were hanging out and all the other overlapping of things, there arose a small little private group of rabbis who were writing private stuff. And they were creating new literature. And this new literature was radically, and I emphasize radically, different from anything that came before it. And out of this bunch of rabbis came what we today know as the Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism in its present form. So, when we want to understand concepts and ideas, such as the divine emanations of God, the question is, how could God be the absolute, unknowable, untouchable? How could that manifest and materialize this physical world of ours? And how do we here on earth reach out and touch the unknowable, unreachable, unfathomable God? Between God and us then came levels of digression, from one step to the next, almost like a filtering from level to level to level to level, till we got to where we are now. Those are the Sephiroth. Or are they? Because I'm not quoting to you Kabbalah. I'm actually quoting to you Plato. Yes, Plato. Plato wrote many, many metaphysical books. These ideas and concepts come from his book called the Timaeus. And the Timaeus is readily available. If you don't want to believe me, and nor should you, go read it for yourself. I love it when people go and actually look up the sources and learn for yourselves. Why on earth do you ever listen to me? Hey, I'll give you something to think about, but go learn it yourself. All right? Now, a little bit about myself. Way back when, long time ago, right? Back in the 90s, we first started. For those of you who will remember, we've been around now for almost 30 years. We started out as very, strongly motivated, polemic, anti-cult, anti-missionary outreach program. And one of the things that I attacked at the time was the scholarly Kabbalah of the Western scholars, kind of people like Gershom Scholem and the like, who dared to question the sacredity of the Holy Zohar. And they blasphemed, so I thought, by saying that it had this Neoplatonic Grecian influence in its ideas and concepts. How dare they say that about our holy Kabbalah, which we know comes from God and Elijah? Okay. Well, I'm the scholar. I'm going to prove them wrong. That's what I said. So I said, I'm going to study all of these Greek philosophers. And I'm going to study the Platonic school and the Neoplatonic school. And I read Plato, and I read Plotinus, and I read Pliny, and I read all these other guys. Like a dog with the tail between my legs. At the end of 2 or 3 years of study, I had to admit that the scholars were right. Yeah, you can't deny the truth. The influence is clearly, definitively there. When you look at the pre-Zoharic schools of, I don't want to call it Kabbalah because that's not the right word, secrets of the Torah. Look at the writings of Rashi, Rabbeinu Tam. Look at the writings of the Baalei Tosafot, Rabbi Yehuda, the Hasid, and Sefer Hasidim, Rabbi Eliezer of Worms, we already mentioned. We have prolific writings from all of the schools of Hasidei Ashkenaz. They were the original, in quote, mystics. Not a clue, not a connection to anything to those schools which came later from southern France and northern Spain. There's an old legend that states that Rabbi Eliezer of Worms did a Kvizat Haderach from Dune, a Kvizat Haderach, and went to Spain and taught Ramban Nachmani the Kabbalah. Well, if he did, I don't know what Ramban learned, because it's certainly not what Rabbi Eliezer taught. They're completely different schools. Here at KosherTorah, I place very strong emphasis on obviously on all the old schools, the prophetic school and the like, but very strong emphasis on the teaching of the Hasidei Ashkenaz. We've done full courses on that. Gosh, you know what? Are the Hilchot Melachim? Do I still have the courses for the laws of angels from the writings of Rabbi Eliezer Gamisa? You know, we did this, and I'm thinking now of all the courses that we have available. I don't think I have these courses readily available. Gosh, we're going to have to do them again. So, for those of you who are KosherTorah school supporting students, more good stuff to come. Yippee-ki-yay. Anyway, we've always placed emphasis on the older schools. Not that I don't teach the new schools. I teach them as well. But I got to put them in their place. Now, why is any of this important? Because going back to the beginning, what happened to our prophecy, our ascent schools, our experiential? Rashi was an experientialist. Rabbeinu Tam was. The Bali Tosafot were. Rabbi Eliezer of Gamisa, Rabbi Yehuda Hasid, all they were experiencing. They did the ascents. They knew this stuff. They lived it. Now I'll even give you another scary, shocking revelation. So did Maimonides, the big father of Aristotelian philosophy. You read his secrets that he put in his Guide to the Perplexed. Ooh, he knew his stuff. Now, when the Guide to the Perplexed of Maimonides came out, it started a fire. Oh my goodness. It literally broke the Jewish world of the 1200s in a civil war. Because Maimonides revealed a whole lot. And it was at this time that those small little groups got together and said, you know, there are real secrets of the Torah, and we know them, and you don't. And we'll only reveal them to our small little circle. And if you want to learn them, then you got to be connected to us. And they call that the Masara, the links of the chain. And if you don't learn from us, you're not going to learn the real deal. And it's forbidden for you to learn. And this was the school of Ramban Nachmani. You can read the Ramban's commentary to the Torah, readily available in English, probably in many other languages as well. And you'll see he's always making references to the secrets of the Torah here, the secrets of the Torah there. And it seems like he's referencing Zohar type secrets, but he wrote his commentary prior to the Zohars being edited. So, prior to this time, Zoharic ideas and concepts were glaringly, completely absent from any place in Judaic literature, period. They just weren't there. Now, of course, later generations said, it was all kept secret, and therefore you couldn't know about it. And they will take their later interpretations and impose it on the earlier interpretations and reinterpret all the old stuff in light of the new. So the Sephiroth of the Sefer Yetzirah are now the 10 divine emanations, Keter Chochmah Bina, and in every English commentary or modern commentary of Sefer Yetzirah, you're going to see that's exactly what it says. Completely overriding and ignoring the older schools. Well, as a scholar, I got a problem when the new guys want to come and say, you old guys don't know nothing. We know better than you do. We Jews have experienced that before when we had a group in the days of the Roman Empire who pretty much said that, you Jews don't even understand your own Torah. You certainly don't understand anything about your own Messiah. We understand your Torah better than you do, and we'll show you what Isaiah 53 means and Isaiah 7:14 means, because we know better than you. It's about whatever you believe for 1,000 years. You're wrong. We're right. I'm referring to Christianity. So I do not like modern reinterpretations of old stuff. You want to have a brand new interpretation of stuff, go do your stuff. But not to the point where you're saying that the old school is wrong. Got a question here. What are the supporting sources for the Rashi belonging to the Ascent school? How about reading Rashi's commentary to the Chumash and the Gemara and see his knowledge and understanding of certain concepts and secrets and draw your own conclusions? How's that? Okay, moving right along. With regards to the new school, the new boy on the block, the Zoharic school, Avraham Abulafia, mid-1200s. This is a guy who's following all the older school paths. He's putting together the letters of the names and putting together all forms of meditations and sound chants and music and the like, just like they did in the days of the Bible. And he comes out with an entire system. But that system was in complete contradiction to the growing system of that small little group growing in France and Spain. And one of their outspoken members was one of the top Talmidim of the Ramban Nachmani, a very famous and authoritative rabbi, Rabbi Shlomo ben Idaret, who is the author of a very famous commentary to the Gemara We call him the Rashba. And that commentary is studied in most yeshivas to this very, very day. Well, the Rashba went to war against Abulafia. He says, how dare you come out with a system which is opposite ours? How dare you teach something that we don't? And I'm condemning you and your system. Well, due to the influence and power they had publicly, the Abulafian system was pretty much thwarted in its growth. If the Rashba did not come out and condemn Abulafia, we might not have had a Zohar. We might have had the Abulafian school as the premier form and expression of Kabbalah today. But we have instead the writings that came out of these groups. And when you look at these writings of the Zohar, it is a completely new understanding of things. And again, if you're a scholar, you will clearly recognize the influence of the Platonic and Neoplatonic influences of philosophy in every page of Zoharic teachings. Now remember something about the Zohar, please. The Zohar is not a single book. The Zohar is a compilation of books, as is the Gemara itself. In the Zohar, if you take the standard Zohar and you look at every page, even different languages is there. There's Hebrew, there's Aramaic, there's different forms of Aramaic, okay? You have the regular body of the Zohar, and then you have books like the Raya Mehemna, the Sitrei Torah, Sifra Ditzniuta, Idra Rabbah, Idra Zuta. You have all these other Sabbat Mishpatim. You have a whole bunch of other ones. And these were like put together, edited to create a concentric whole. The legend wants to say Shimon Bar Yochai wrote this, but technically it doesn't even say that. It says that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai dictated to his Talmud Rabbi Abba that it should be written. But the concepts and philosophies and ideas that you find in the Zohar, like I said, do your homework, are clearly Neoplatonic. Many of those ideas were not even developed in Neoplatonism until at least a century or more after Rabbi Shimon, the historical one, passed away. So we got some interesting stuff there. So we relate the Zohar, of course, to the great Rabbi Moshe de Leon. He was a pretty big Talmid Chacham himself. And we have other books of his to this day readily available. And he knew his stuff. But surprisingly, there are things written in the Zohar and things written in Moshe de Leon which aren't exactly the same either. So there probably was a number of different authors who compiled the works of the Zohar. Did they write from a philosophical, analytical point of view like a Gemara? Or were they psychically, intuitively channeling it? It's a good question. Being that we're not there to watch the authors as they put it together, we can't say. But we do recognize that the Zohar was the beginnings of a completely different understanding of what we call mystical Judaism, which supplanted everything that existed before it for the last 1,000 years. And the one thing that the Zohar never, ever talks about is psychic ascent. No meditative traditions, no practices, no outlines for meditations or mantras or Shemot Kodashim, nothing of the kind, no instructions, all talk. Now, I am most certainly, definitely not anti-Zohar. I think the Zohar is one of the greatest books of Judaism. Some will call it the third book in Judaism next to the Tanakh and Gemara. It's probably true. The halachic authority of the Zohar is well documented, well known. Very famous disagreement between Rabbi Yosef Karo, the author of the Beit Yosef and the Shulchan Aruch, and Rabbi Moshe Isserles, author of the Darkei Moshe, commentary to the Torah, and the Mappa, or the Hagaot to the Shulchan Aruch. And the Zohar is well documented. But we must understand that the Zohar and everything that came forth from it is a completely different school. than the Hasidei Ashkenaz, Abulafia, the Hechalot, the Merkava, and everything that came before it. And everything that came before it was rewritten, reinterpreted in light of the new. And people today don't see a difference between the two because everything's been rewritten in the same way. This is not scholarly accurate. And I don't like that. Now, believe whatever you want. That doesn't matter. People will say today that the Kitvei Ari, the writings of Rabbi Isaac Luria, were given to Rabbi Chaim Vital from Elijah the prophet. You want to believe that? Great. We have no record of when Elijah the prophet did that. No witnesses, no testimony. Just we say it. We say it. We believe it, and that's it. Fine. I'll accept that. I don't need to be analytical about it. It's a matter of faith. But now, the Zoharic school was originally introduced as the Midrash, legendary teachings of Shimon Bar Yochai. It took a while before they were pretty much accepted and then became standard. What happened to good old poor Avraham Abulafia and the older teachings? They never disappeared. They took a back burner. Avraham Abulafia's teachings were always there. We know that they were the source of writings of books like the Sulam Aliyah from the chief rabbi, I think it was chief rabbi of Jerusalem back in the 1400s, Rabbi Yehuda Albatoni. Other rabbis were clearly influenced by Abulafia, and his techniques of practicality are still there. You just don't see them in the Zoharic school. So, coming on down to the big place of modern Kabbalah, to the school of course, Rabbi Isaac Luria, the famous Arizal, 1500s, Sfat. Well, the Ari was a big meditator. He used to go out and meditate 6 days. He used to go out and live, on a private island in Egypt as he grew up. And he would only come home for Shabbat. Some wives are today that might want to encourage their husbands to do that today. But won't go there. Anyway, and of course, he met up with Chaim Vital. Now, Chaim Vital is considered the redactor of the Lurianic system and the, in quote, father of the Lurianic Kabbalah, and therefore the philosophical school thereof. But Chaim Vital was the last thing you'd ever call him was a philosophic Kabbalist. Rabbi Chaim was of the old prophetic school, practiced the Abulafian techniques, and when he published them, or let me rephrase that, take that back, printed them, wrote them into his book, The Gates of Holiness, Part 4, the editors who were going to publish the book took one look at it and says, we won't publish it. So they always published parts 1, 2, and 3 of Sha'arei Kedusha, which became a classic. But part 4, because of all the secret details of Abulafian teachings, was censored and edited from its time of writing in the early 1600s to the late 1990s, when part 4 of Sha'arei Kedusha was published for the first time ever. And that led, finally, in the aughts, to the first time, the publications of the writings of Avraham Abulafia. They were kept out of print for 800 years. But they're back. This isn't the first time, modern times. Through the ages, we always had the old school and teachers of the old school pop up. One of the famous ones, of course, was the Baal Shem Tov. Now, I'm talking about Rabbi Israel himself. Rabbi Israel was clearly the old school, and if you look in his Amud Tefillah and others, he clearly gives you meditative techniques to practice. And for those who've done the scholarly research, scholars kind of like Moshe Dell have, I think, you see the Abulafian influence there. But second generation, everything changed and flipped back and became again philosophical and analytic. So today, when you look at Kabbalah, as it's been taught for maybe the past 300-400 years, the Abulafian influence has been censored out. The experiential has been censored out, especially as our society, world, Western civilization, became more and more rational and analytical. All the intuitive stuff was pretty much censored out of the Judaic traditions. And those of the old experiential schools pretty much existed in isolated little pockets, such as in southern Morocco, certain communities in Yemen, and certain other far-flung Kabbalistic areas. And we have some of the books of these rabbis, and they're very, very different from the philosophical Lurianic type texts. Many of you might be familiar with the writings of rabbis like Rabbi Avraham Hamawi, who dealt with all these things, as well as others. Now, you had the growth during this period of the famous philosophical metaphysical schools of Judaism, such as everything came out of the Ariel, such as the writings of later Hasidim, the Gaon of Vilna, Ramchal, and of course the famous Rashash in Israel. Well, most of these schools to this very day are all very bluntly metaphysical philosophy, having not a clue of what they owe to Plato and the Neoplatonists. And they are the schools, rigid unto themselves, just like the Rashba, not willing to give anything, not giving anything to any of the other schools. When the Abulafian works were published, modern scholars of the Rashash school condemned them, just like Rashba did 800 years before. They're as closed and narrow in any understanding of things as they've always been. And they created their own perspective and understanding of the universe, which is in its own little construct bubble. So very, very much different from the experiencers who went before them for thousands of years. And that is really where we are at now in what we call the secrets of Torah, and why I refer to the later teachings as what they call it, Kabbalah. And I will not use that term to discuss, or reference, I should say, the earlier teachings, which really shouldn't be called by that name. Yeah, we can use the name. We can still take the modern and put it on top of and reinterpret the old. Everybody does it to this day, so why not? But again, from a historical and scholarly point of view, that's just not really the truth. So, my job here as a scholar is to inform you of these, and I have to tell you, facts. Nothing that I shared here now was opinion. You will find that if you research this in the writings and teachings of many, many different sources, it's all out there. Remember, if I learn anything, I have to confess to you, for those of you who think that, I'm Darth Vader incarnate or Obi-Wan Kenobi incarnate, depending on your point of view on me. No, I don't have any psychic mystic powers beyond the norm, whatever that means. But when I learn stuff, I get the books and I learn from the books. And I guess the only real difference between me and many of my peers is I open those books like Raziel HaMalach, the book of the angel Raziel. I actually study it. I look at the teachings of Abulafia and the teachings of the ancients, and I study them, not for theory, but for practice. They say do it like this, I do it like that. And my peers, they have the same books on their shelves. Theirs collect dust. Mine collect notes. I guess maybe that's the only difference really between us. So this is where we are at today. A school of what we call the secrets of Torah, which is really a pshat, a metaphysical philosophy. And then you have the real deep stuff, which is the practical and experiential. You had rabbis, great rabbis like Rabbi Yosef Chaim of Baghdad, who was clearly of the Rashash school, clearly of the Zoharic camp, of the rational, rational intellectual path, clearly of that through and through. And yet he himself writes about the distinction between the two groups. And he refers to the modern stuff as the pshat of Sod, and the deep stuff as the Sod of Sod. And he understood the distinction between them. And unfortunately, most people today do not. And therefore, they continue in their metaphysical studies, and they believe that they have a power. But unfortunately, I just don't. And this, unfortunately, comes into play in very real ways. You see me hesitating here to tell you a story. I might have told it before, but I'm going to tell it to you again. We all know what happened in the last century with the Holocaust. The Jews of Europe were pretty much wiped out. But yet, even though the Nazis landed in North Africa, nothing happened there. It has been told me by people who claim to be in the know that because the Europeans were so rationally motivated, rationally and ideal, all of their Kabbalists were the philosophical school, and they lost the ability to make psychic ascent and have psychic influence and to fight psychic warfare. Whereas the rabbis in the Holy Land of Israel and throughout North Africa, remember I told you those small pockets like in Yemen, South Morocco, they never lost that. And they did fight psychically. And my Rebbe Meir Levi Alav Shalom told me one of these psychic battles that happened in 1941. So I know. What am I drinking? Something. What do you care what it is? I'm not here to endorse a product. But anyway, yeah, this does make a difference, especially in modern times. Just in conclusion, I don't think you need to be a prophet or a rocket scientist to recognize we're living in a time where we can pretty much say that we're watching the collapse of Western civilization. It's happened before. Don't be shocked and amazed. Things are not going to go back to normal. You got crazy stuff going on. And this is the time to raise up psychic warriors. This is time to recognize and understand psychic warfare. That's what I wrote, Let There Be Knowing about, and what I'm presently putting together for my next book. We got to go back to the old ways. We got to go back to the original ways. Yes, learning Zohar is wonderful and great. I do it all the time. I teach it all the time. I teach Kitvera, you know that, right? I have no problems with these other schools, but I put them in their proper context. And I don't fantasize about the powers that they have that they just don't. Anyway, my point is why it is important that this class, this series, as I said, it's Kabbalah 101 plus, what your other rabbis aren't going to tell you. Because we need to get back to understanding the old ways of Torah, the Hebraic ways, the ways of the first temple, the ways before the Greek influence. We have to, in the wise words of Master Yoda, unlearn what we have learned and pretty much learn from scratch. My books are out there. My courses are out there. This is the focus of our KosherTorah school. This is why I choose to be in a remote area, away from all the hub and bub and noise of the big urban cities. I don't need to get in fights with all the other rabbis and argue, bicker. This is why, thank God, we've been blessed. We just acquired property this last year that has our own cave. Yay, just like Shimon Bar Yochai and Eliyahu. And we are presently working, God bless us, to get the funding needed that we can build a property, put our buildings down, and get it up to become a regular, real, active retreat center so that we can bring people and start training you guys. Because that, in my opinion, right or wrong, good or bad, is now a matter of life and death. We've ran out of time to speculate and talk. Now's the time for action. And I hope this class has been some help in giving some insight into these things. So the rest is up to you, what you're going to do with it. So thank you again for joining me tonight. God be willing, we'll pick up next time with other stuff on this topic. If you're interested in more of our deeper classes and teachings, consider becoming a monthly supporter of our KosherTorah school. We ask for a gift of $50 a month or more, and we put you on a list. They give you all the private good stuff, discounts on the other courses available, and of course, access to me. Because in all due respect, everybody wants to call and shut my ear off. I'm sorry. I don't have the time to talk to everybody. Okay, I can't. I have to be selective. And if you guys choose to be there for me, well, I'm there for you. That's the way it works. All right, so thank you for those of you who are my supporters. And for those of you who want more, maybe consider joining our school. All right, Ariel Bar Tzadok, KosherTorah School. I'm going to sign off. I'll see you all next time. Kol Tov. Shalom.